never translated to the production, the consistency that you'd want to see on the football field. And I wrote about this after the game. I mean, just comparing the preseason stats between Clifford and Pratt. I mean, Clifford was more effective, or excuse me, Pratt was more effective. He was more efficient just by the pure numbers of it. And so all of those, advantages that I just listed that we thought were playing in Clifford's favor weren't showing itself on the field. And then as far as Pratt goes, I mean, he's a seventh round pick coming into an offense that LaFleur is equated to for young players or quarterbacks like drinking water out of a fire hose. Like, it is a lot, and you could see him navigating that learning curve. And so that consistency again that they're looking for just wasn't there. And so you bring in Malik Willis, who still a developmental player, but in terms of upside, ceiling, potential, I mean, massive arm, ability to make plays with his legs. I mean, the Packers, upgraded in that regard in terms of what his ceiling is compared to Sean Clifford and Michael Pratt. So definitely taking a swing to see if they can help him unlock that potential he has.
Yeah, and I think the Packers coaching staff is, one of the best to potentially unlock that potential for Malik Willis. So obviously this makes things interesting when you're trying to predict the 53-man roster. How many quarterbacks are they going to keep? It seems to be that Malik Willis is coming in to be the backup. And so the question is, do they keep a third quarterback?
Yeah, for me, if we had all put our roster predictions together and knew that this trade was going to be a part of the equation, there isn't really much that changes for me. I think, as we mentioned, Malik Willis is going to be the backup. I think what the Packers are going to do is try to bring Michael Pratt back to be the practice squad quarterback. So I think they're still going to go into the season with two quarterbacks. We saw them do that last year. And I think just from a roster perspective, I think that there's more routes you can go down by only having two quarterbacks on the roster. Because if you go three, now there's a trickle down effect to that, to you're having to go lighter at other position groups. So I think that they're going to end up trying to get Pratt back on the practice squad. That's my prediction as of now. And then Love and Willis are going to be two quarterbacks on the 53.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I mean, this, for me, it was very hard. Lots of players kind of showed out during the preseason and training camp, and so it was difficult to put this together. And if you're keeping three quarterbacks, it makes it that much more difficult to try to predict. So we'll get into that here. Obviously, I kind of have the benefit of incorporating this Willis news into my prediction because I have not gone live with it yet or posted it anywhere. So as far as quarterback, I do have them keeping two, Jordan Love and Malik Willis, and I'm assuming that's what you would change if you knew that they were going to trade for Willis.
Yep, correct.
All right, so I guess we'll move to running back. This is a little more of a conversation, and I think you can kind of take it multiple ways because A.J. Dillon and Marshawn Lloyd are both injured at the moment, and we don't really know the timetable for their return as of now, and so it's kind of difficult to predict. Obviously, Emmanuel Wilson, to me, was a huge winner coming out of training camp. I mean, every time he touched the ball in preseason, he looked explosive, and he was finding lanes and just ran really well. I was really impressed with him, and I think he's shown improvement in some of the other areas like pass blocking and, catching the ball out of the backfield, which the Packers really like their running backs to be able to do. So I do think he makes the roster, and right now I have Josh Jacobs, A.J. Dillon, and Emmanuel Wilson making the roster with Marshawn Lloyd starting as one of the two designated to return injured reserve players. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm in a similar spot. Again, we don't know the timelines right now for Lloyd's return or A.J. Dillon's stinger that he's dealing with. I had a similar backfield put together as you had. Josh Jacobs, Emmanuel Wilson on the roster. I had A.J. Dillon starting on IR, designated to return, and then I had Marshawn Lloyd on the 53. Again, just speculation at this point because we don't know the extent of the injuries that they're working through. But if A.J. Dillon's not going to be available for Week 1, I mean, even if Marshawn Lloyd is able to play Week 1, and we don't know that yet, it feels like that's a situation where Emmanuel Wilson's going to be the backup running back in that game, just because Lloyd has unfortunately had to miss time. He's an incoming rookie. There's still that, we talk about the learning curve, that adjustment period. He's still going to be working through that. And Emmanuel Wilson's in his second season in the NFL, in the offense, and as you mentioned, looked really, really good with the ball in his hands, has improved in those other areas, pass blocking, pass catching. So, it's shaping up to where he could be the backup running back come Week 1.
Yeah, and I'm kind of excited for that. I'd love to see him get some touches when it matters a little bit more. So moving on to wide receiver, I have them keeping 6 wide receivers. Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, kind of the real locks, and Bo Melton is very close to a lock, if not one. And then it's kind of down to Grant DuBose and Malik Heath. And I have them keeping Grant DuBose. I know a lot of people have Malik Heath. I just couldn't get over the fact that they were Jason Vrabel had mentioned that they were showing clips of Grant DuBose run blocking to the team in team meetings. And I thought that was really, really good. And I realized Malik Heath has really shown that he can run block as well. And that's something, again, that they look for in some of those fringe guys looking to get on the back end of a roster. So I have them keeping Grant DuBose. I think he could offer a little bit more in the passing game as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it feels almost like a coin flip. Grant DuBose came on in the early part of camp. Malik Heath had his stretch of play here in the latter portion. And as you're putting these roster predictions together, you try to, and I asked Matt LaFleur about this, it's about the totality of, the 19 practices plus the preseason games. Obviously, you want to see them perform in the game-like environment. But it's a totality of everything that they've put together in this process. And for me, I went with Malik Heath, and I know it didn't always show through in production, but in that joint practice against the Ravens, I mean, he had some really, really good routes against their starting defense. In the Denver game, when they were playing their starters early on, Sean Clifford wasn't quite able to connect with him early on, but he won that route. There was another route later in the game downfield where, again, Michael Pratt overthrew him. So I think just in terms of, again, the production part wasn't always showing up, but I felt that overall from, those other aspects that contribute to it, the route running ability, the run blocking, I just thought that Malik Heath was the more steady of the two. But again, this is a really, really close one, and it's going to be interesting to see which direction the Packers go.
Yeah, for sure. Tight end, I think, is pretty simple. I have them keeping 3: Luke Musgrave, Tucker Kraft, and Ben Sims. And I have Tyler Davis starting out on the injured reserve, designated to return. I think that's how a lot of other people have it as well. I think with Davis on IR, I don't really think, at least I haven't seen a whole lot on the timeline for that shoulder injury, but he is coming off an ACL as well, and he's likely the 3rd or 4th tight end, depending on where you would slot him in there with Ben Sims. But I think it's, not a bad idea to let him sit out 4 weeks to start the year. And unless injuries hit early, they shouldn't really need him until that point.
Yeah, I had the same prediction as you did with the tight ends. And again, all we know is it's a shoulder injury right now. We don't know if what kind of shoulder injury it is. We don't have any sort of timeline out there. So, if he's ready to be back sooner and later, then that obviously changes things. But right now we just don't know. We're 11 days away from, I think 11 days away from week 1. But either way, I think if he's healthy and good to go, I think the Packers find a way to put him on this team. And I know the lasting image that many had was that Denver game, and he did not have his best performance in that game. But from just a pure blocking standpoint, and that's a lot of what he's going to be asked to do. I thought that he put together the more sound training camp in that regard compared to Ben Sims. Now, especially towards the end of training camp, where you really started to see Ben Sims shine was in the passing game. I mean, down the seam in particular, there was a couple completions through those last several practices where with the second team offense, he was making plays. But from a pure blocking standpoint, I thought that's where Tyler Davis had the edge over him. And something to keep in mind that, with Josiah DeGuara no longer here, he filled that do-it-all H-back role, primarily blocking, could impact the passing game if needed, but lining up in the backfield, in line, in the slot, bouncing around the formation. And that's not a massive role in this offense. By the end of last season, I think DeGuara's snap count was around 12, 13, 14 snaps, but that's still 15 to 20% of the snaps each week. Like, that's not nothing either. Like, that is a role within this offense, and I think it's one that Tyler Davis is well suited to fit. And then there's the special teams component of it too. I mean, Rich Bisaccia has spoken incredibly highly of just the value that he brings to that phase of the game, able to be out there on 4, 5, maybe even all 6 of the special teams phases that are a part of this game. So I think Tyler Davis, whether it's, the injury lingers and he has to start on IR or he's good to go and on the 53, I think that's the path for him to be on this team because there are multiple ways for him to make an impact this season.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that, they've always been high on Tyler Davis, and certainly makes an impact on special teams. So it's good to have him for that and potentially that H-back role as well. As far as offensive line, I have them keeping 10. I've seen predictions where only 9 are on there, even one where there was only 8, which seems a little bit thin to me. In the past, at least last year, they've kept 10 on the initial roster, so I decided to go with that here, and it makes it fairly easy if you're going to keep 10, and I have Rasheed Walker, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, Sean Ryan, Zach Tom, Jordan Morgan, Andre Dillard, Jacob Monk, Travis Glover, and Kadeem Telfort. I think from everything I've been hearing, and obviously I get a lot of my information from you guys, what you guys see at camp and what you're posting on X, and so those seem to be the guys that have kind of separated themselves from the rest. Is that right?
Yeah, I had the same 10 as you did. I had them going a little bit heavy at that position, but like you mentioned, it's something we've seen the Packers do in the past, and that tackle position, the backup tackle position. Andre Dillard, even before the preseason games, you could tell from being on the sidelines at practice, from the rotations, that he was starting to separate himself. As Zach Tom got eased back into the team portion of practice, he didn't, he wasn't taking 100% of the team snaps when he first returned from that pec injury. So, if he was on the field for 3, came off for the 4th, a lot of times it was Andre Dillard stepping in at right tackle for him. So that was kind of our first, glimpse into what that potential pecking order was for that backup tackle role. So I would have him at the top of that. And then Kadeem Telfort, he was in the mix early on. He's been playing as of late with the second team offense at the end of training camp, both left and right side of the offensive line, at left tackle, at right tackle. And then over the last week, just before that last preseason game, we saw Travis Glover seemingly jump Caleb Jones in terms of being that third guy at the tackle position. And from that point forward, Caleb Jones spent a lot of his time with the third team offense. Glover was as we saw in the preseason games. He was with the second unit. He was playing right tackle only. But we've seen in the past that the Packers are very willing to roster additional guys along the offensive line, especially at the tackle position, if they're young, if they see upside potential that they want to try to develop. I mean, just last 2 years, Caleb Jones and Luke Tenuta filled those roles. They were on the 53-man roster, and I think oftentimes, Tenuta was injured last year, but for Caleb Jones specifically, I think a lot of the times he was inactive on game days. But again, plays a premier position. It's a young player upside that they want to tap into. So I think that they're going to take that same approach because they just used a 6th-round pick to draft Travis Glover. Kadeem Telfert's an undrafted rookie, but he's only in his second season. So they both check those boxes in terms of what we've seen the Packers look for and want to try to develop at that position. And last thing I'll say, we've all been watching who's going to emerge as the swing tackle off the bench. For a number of years, the Packers had Yosh Nijman that they could rely on in that role. My guess right now is it's going to be specific. I think if they need a left tackle, I think that's Andre Dillard. I think if they need a right tackle, it's going to be, my guess right now would be Telfert based on rotation, but Telfert or Glover. It feels like they're going to kind of split that off, and they could even look into moving guys around the starting offensive line, but it doesn't feel like they truly found that swing tackle they were hoping for because Dillard was, he was performed much better on the left side versus the right side.
Yeah, that's kind of what I had gathered as well. So it could be interesting if injuries start to hit because it doesn't feel like they have quite as much depth, specifically at the tackle position, as they've had in the past. So things could get interesting if some injuries occur to the starting line. As far as the defense, we'll transition to the defensive side of the ball and start with the interior defensive line. I think this is pretty easy as well. I have them keeping 5: Kenny Clark, TJ Slayton, Devontae Wyatt, Carl Brooks, and Colby Wooden. I'm guessing that's what you had as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, putting this roster prediction together top to bottom, it was challenging because it felt like there was about 54, 55 guys that you're trying to find a way onto this team. But at the defensive tackle position, that was the easy one. We know the 5 that are going to be on this team and a part of that rotation.
Yep. And then as far as defensive end, Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, Kingsley Enagbari, and Lucas Van Ness. I have only 4. Obviously, Aaron Mosby really had a big game versus the Ravens, and Brenton Cox has been flashing as well. But I decided to kind of leave both of those guys off, and part of it was because of the lack of special teams value. Mosby may be more of a special teams guy. Maybe you can tell me the way that looked in camp, whether he was taking a lot of special team snaps or not. But from what I've heard, Brenton Cox has not been extremely involved in special teams, not really his thing, I guess. And so really he's kind of a one-trick pony. He's a pass rusher, and outside of that, he's not doesn't have a whole lot of value and likely wouldn't be getting onto the field much, as opposed to someone like a Christian Welch, who I have making the roster, who can give you some value on special teams. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so this was one of those difficult decisions where I had the roster prediction done and I sat on it for a full day because I wanted to find a way to get either Christian Welch or Zane Anderson onto the roster. I knew I wasn't going to get both, but I was trying to find a way to get one. That special teams value that you mentioned, and leaving Brenton Cox off was, I think, what I was coming to, the most likely path for me to accomplish that. However, I ended up not going that route. Reason why, and I think you're spot on to where in trying to find what the path is for Brenton Cox to see playing time this season, it's tough. he's at a deep position group where typically it's a 4-man rotation on the defensive side of the ball. Special teams is an area that he's focused on. He's wanting to or needing to find a way to contribute in that capacity. I think if we recall the 49ers playoff game last year, when Enagbari was out, Brenton Cox was on the 53-man roster, but they made him inactive and brought up Keyshawn Banks from the practice squad. They elevated him for that game to take Enagbari's special team snaps. So again, that's an area where if he's going to see the field, he has to improve on. He has to find a way to contribute. So those are all reasons, as you mentioned, why the Packers could decide to move on for him for someone like Christian Welch, who how he's going to impact your team this season. And playing 4 or 5 special teams units, Zane Anderson the same. However, the reason that I ended up keeping Brenton Cox is I was trying to put on my GM hat and make sure I'm taking a long-term perspective at this roster building. And Brenton Cox, I think in the long term, absolutely has a path to contributing to this team. We look at that edge rusher group, defensive end group. Preston Smith, this might be his final year. Maybe he has 2 years left in Green Bay. Obviously, just pontificating here, but he's getting closer. He's closer to the end of his time in Green Bay versus it beginning. And Brenton Cox would be someone who would slot right into that rotation at that point. A Christian Welch, a Zane Anderson, you don't see them being long-term players with this Packers team. So that was one of the reasons why I ended up keeping Brenton Cox. The other one is the position, defensive end, pass rusher, get after the quarterback. It's a premier position. It's the name of the game in the NFL. He can absolutely do that part of the equation, and that is extremely valuable. The last thing, and I'll say this, I think a lot of times we overstate the likelihood that the players that we're watching are going to get released and claimed by somebody else. Like, the odds of that happening are always so much lower than I think what we on the outside looking in expect. But taking that into the equation, I think Cox is much more likely to get picked up by another team than Christian Welch. Christian Welch was released last year by the Ravens. Nobody claimed him. Packers signed him to the practice squad. He's eventually signed to the 53-man a few weeks into the season. So that was just my thought process behind it all. Like I said at the start of all of that, I very much see why you went the path that you did. But for those reasons, that's why I ended up keeping Cox on the roster.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just how many angles you can look at it, how many angles you can take. Like, I've seen so many different reasons for why you should keep different players, and it's
that's
kind
the
of
fun,
fascinating.
right?
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. Like, there's just so many angles. You can take the now approach, the future approach, look at special teams, or look at actual value. Other than special teams, like on the defense or on the offense. And, with guys on the back end of the roster, you are looking for more special teams value, and so that's kind of where I ended up. And so looking at the linebackers, I have them keeping 6. I believe, if I remember right, they kept 4 on the initial roster last year. But they are, I guess, transitioning to a 4-3 defense, and so more linebackers could be better in that scenario. So I have them keeping Quay Walker, Isaiah McDuffie, Tyron Hopper, Eric Wilson, Edgerrin Cooper, and Christian Welch. And again, Christian Welch kind of for Bretton Cox, I guess. Using that spot for him. I was kind of debating between those two. So, I do have Welch getting on here. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, if I was trying to fit 54, 55 guys onto my roster, Welch was number 54. Just the absolute special teams value that he brings. So on my roster, I had the 5 linebackers, the 5 you mentioned, without Christian Welch, and I like as I mentioned, I kept Brenton Cox to, which numbers-wise didn't make it work out in that regard for me. But in going down the path that I did, you are relying heavily on Hopper and Cooper to come in and contribute on special teams. Linebacker is a heavy, heavy special teams position. There's
Yeah.
I think Eric Wilson, Isaiah McDuffie were both top 5 on the Packers in special team snaps last year, and with those guys taking on larger defensive roles this season, they're going to need those guys in the middle back end of that linebacker room to come in and be able to contribute. And just like we talk about the learning curve from college to the NFL on offense, on defense, with that jump that you're making, it's the same thing on special teams too. Like that's a part of the equation. So there's probably going to be some ups and downs as young players coming in and being asked to contribute heavily in those roles. But also from Rich Bisaccia's perspective, I mean, you are getting elite athletes, talent now on your special teams unit to help you in that phase of the game. So, like we talked about, there's kind of two sides to everything. And the last thing I'll say, and you brought it up, the switch to the 4-3. One of the other reasons outside of just Christian Welch's play this summer that I wanted to try to find a way to get him on the roster was Gutekunst at the combine, and this stuck with me, and I don't know if it's one of those things that I'm just like reading too much into, but he mentioned that in switching to the 4-3, there might be the need to roster additional linebackers on between the 53 and the practice squad, just from a pure numbers perspective. And so that stuck with me. And again, he mentioned the 53 and the practice squad. So potentially that means going heavy on the practice squad if you stick with 5 on the 53 or however the math works out. But that's something, at least from what he said. And Gutekunst has left little nuggets like that for us along the way during his tenure here, where you look back on it and you go, oh, he told us this. So that's something that stuck with me as well, and why I wanted to get him on there. But as I was putting this together, I wanted to make sure that my reasoning was I was 100% behind it, and why I was putting someone on versus why I was leaving someone off, and led to those tough decisions.
Yeah, for sure. So on to cornerback, I have them keeping 6, and I believe it's the same 6 that you predicted that they would keep as well. I have Jair Alexander, Eric Stokes, Carrington Valentine, Keyshawn Nixon, Corey Ballantyne, and Kalen King. There's obviously a little bit of a debate between Robert Rochelle and Kalen King. I think the fact that Rochelle was banged up a little bit with that hip injury, that was kind of the tiebreaker, I guess, for me. What are your thoughts there?
Yep, I had the same 6 as you. I really like what Corey Ballantyne just brings to the defense. I think he played over 400 snaps last season defensively, and I mean, when they called upon him, he was very, very steady playing out on the boundary. This summer, when they're in the team portion of practice, he's been with the second team and he's been lined up on the boundary. But during the individual portion, he's been working out with Kalen King and Keyshawn Nixon in the slot. So adding just a little added versatility to his game. We've seen in the past he can be a special teams contributor. So kind of like we were talking about with Tyler Davis, there's just, you see a number of different avenues for him to be able to help this team out. And especially when you're talking about middle back end of the roster guys, like that's important. That stuff matters. How many different ways could you potentially help this team? And then Kalen King, even if there wasn't the injury uncertainty around Robert Rochelle, I still would have had Kalen King on that roster. And the reason being, one, I really liked what I saw from Kalen King this summer. He was a boundary cornerback at Penn State, transitioning to the slot, but looked very natural in there. Very, very willing tackler, very physical tackler. We saw splash plays from him too. Had the forced fumble against Baltimore. I think he had 2 interceptions throughout training camp. Had a quote unquote sack as well. So we're seeing the splash plays from him. I love the physicality that he brings, and when you combine that with realizing that this is a pretty new position for him, again, because he played on the boundary, you love the upside, you love the potential that you see from him and the potential larger roles that he could play down the road for you. As far as Rochelle in the mix, because I had Corey Ballantyne already on the roster, who's likely going to be a special teams guy, assuming that the cornerback position is healthy. I would have kept Kalen King anyways, because you want to get that upside that potential on the roster versus having another special teams player in Rochelle. So that would have been the tiebreaker for me.
Yeah. All right. So finishing out the defense, we have safety. I kept 5. Xavier McKinney, Javon Bullard, Anthony Johnson Jr., Evan Williams, and Katan Oladapo. Obviously, there was, you mentioned Zane Anderson earlier, and the kind of the special teams value he brings to the team, and he was on the roster last year. I'm not sure if he made the initial one or not, but he was on for a good portion of the season as kind of that special teams guy, and in case of emergency, if there are a lot of injuries to that position group. It's going to be interesting to see how they handle. I assume Javon Bullard will get most of the snaps, along with Xavier McKinney there as a starting safety. But, I mean, all of these guys have flashed from all accounts during camp.
Yeah, this was hands down from top to bottom my favorite position group to watch. The physicality, the flying around the field, and not that they're running any game plan specific things in training camp, but you got a glimpse of what this safety position can be in Jeff Hafley's defense with the late post snap movement, the Javon Bullard playing deep one snap, in the slot the next, Evan Williams coming in. Like, there's just so much mixing and matching opportunity with this group that's versatile, extremely physical. And even Anthony Johnson, with the signing of McKinney, the incoming rookies, like, he's someone that, maybe can be forgotten about in that room. But I was really impressed with him too, just the way he was able to bounce from strong safety to free safety. It's a really, really exciting room that I can't wait to watch in a live game setting when they're all in the field. And as far as I think Bullard's going to be the quote unquote starter. When the depth chart's released, it's going to be McKinney and then him. But we're going to see a lot of Evan Williams this season. I mean, his ability to just be around the ball, to make plays on the football was so impressive. And I think one way that you can get him on the field, and Matt LaFleur alluded to this a little bit when talking about the nickel position, is they could have different nickel personnel based on the opponent, based on how they're lined up. And so I think there's the opportunity there to use both Keyshawn Nixon and Javon Bullard in the slot based on who the opponent is. And then, of course, when you have Bullard in the slot in those instances, now you have the opportunity to get Evan Williams on the field. So just, again, it feels like endless possibilities at that safety position in terms of what Jeff Hafley has the opportunity to do from a game plan standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded like Evan Williams was really picked off a lot of passes during camp. And so that's definitely exciting, just the turnovers aspect of this defense, to see more of those, something we've not seen a ton of the past couple of years. And so it'd be great to see the defense generate some more turnovers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the biggest things they have to improve upon. I think they had 7 interceptions last season, which was the second fewest in football. I mean, they gotta find a way to make more plays on the ball, and I think this Hafley defense is going to help them be in position. Ultimately at the end of the day, like, players on the field, players got to make the plays, but the coaches have to make sure they're drawing up game plans to put them in positions to make plays on the ball. So I'm excited to see all that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, and on to special teams here real quick. I think this is pretty cut and dried. Kicker, Anders Carlson. I guess that's possibly the only one that's maybe a little bit like you're not totally sure on it. They could bring in another kicker, but of the kickers they have on the roster right now, it seems like Carlson is clearly out ahead of the rest of them. He ended up out kicking Greg Joseph, and he's younger and hopefully has more upside at this point in his career as well. So I think he makes the roster unless they sign someone else. And I think to start, they'll probably roll with him. And of course, the punter is Daniel Whalen. Really like what I've heard and seen from him. And long snapper Matt Orzik.
Yep, I had the same three, and to your point on Carlson, that for me this entire process and Carlson versus Joseph, I felt like if Joseph was going to be the week one kicker, like he would have had to go out and really dominate that matchup because anything that was remotely close, even with his percentage at the end of training camp was a little bit higher than Carlson's. I think you go with Carlson in that instance because Joseph is in his fifth, I think going into his fifth NFL season. He's a career 82% field goal kicker. He made, I think, 79% of them here in training camp. Like, that's who he is. And if he's your kicker this season, you're probably going into next April or next March during free agency thinking, hey, we got to address the kicker position or at least bring in some competition for Greg Joseph. Whereas with Carlson in year two, you hope that you can unlock that potential, that upside you mentioned that they saw in him when they drafted him as a young player, as a second-year player, where hopefully he can be your guy for the long haul. Now he has to prove that, and it felt like after how this last on week folded, with Carlson making his kicks, Greg Joseph missed the one in Denver. He had a really rough practice on Tuesday. I think he even missed one during the joint practice. It felt like, all right, this is it, Carlson's job. And then on the last field goal attempt, 32-yarder in the preseason game, missed it. And again, doesn't change my roster prediction. I had Carlson on before then. I have Carlson on now, but there's just that little extra doubt that slips into your mind with that miss. And we talked about with the quarterback position, Matt LaFleur was, non-committal about the backup role, saying they would kind of see what their options are. He's had similar sentiments about the kicker position as well. So I have to think the Packers are seeing what's out there, seeing what's going to happen during roster cutdowns, and before I thought Carlson was pretty much going to be the week one starter. That's still my guess right now, but I feel less likely that could be the case than what I did previously.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's certainly something to monitor, and I mean, I certainly don't really feel confident with Carlson out there. But at this point, I'm not sure I would with any other, kickers that are available at the moment. So I guess, you just kind of roll with them to start the year and hope things, work out eventually.
Yeah, that's the give and take with this, right? Because like you mentioned, there's the unknown that Anders Carlson brings to the equation. And, is he going to make the kick? Is he not? That's kind of the same thing for whoever you bring in. Like, if someone's released in the next 24 hours, like, they were released for a reason, and you no longer have that runway of training camp where you can have them going up against each other and comparing how they perform. Like, if the Packers bring in a new kicker, like, that is their kicker for the regular season, and there isn't the opportunity to see how things unfold in practice or in a preseason game. Like, it's the regular season, it matters. So it's just a tough situation to be in.
Yeah. All right, well, I guess we'll wrap things up. I really appreciate you coming on. Had a great time talking Packers with you, and just great to get some of that insight from inside the training camp practices. I live in Pennsylvania, so it's not like I'm going to be attending any practices. My dad grew up in Wisconsin, so that's kind of where I got my Packers fandom. But I certainly will be, following along from home throughout the season, and really excited, for week one to, get into some real football. Should be a lot of fun. But, yeah, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it, and tell everyone, our small village of listeners, where they can find you.
Hey, I appreciate you having me. It was fun talking Packers. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Bretl. Find all my work over at ESPNlacrosse.com.
All right. Well, like I said, it was great having you on, and I guess maybe we'll talk later sometime. All right. That is all for
Awesome.
this week's episode. Now you have my prediction, and we'll see what happens. I honestly thought it was going to be late enough that, they could start making roster cuts. But the cool thing about the Packers is they normally kind of wait till the day
It's
of
going to
to
be,
start
yep.
really.
Yeah, they'll
really,
probably start trickling in mid-morning,
yep.
and then about half of them will be done by the deadline. We'll figure out the rest after.
Yep, there you go. So, should be a
Awesome.
fun day tomorrow, seeing how everything shakes out there. But thanks for listening, everybody. Appreciate the support as always, and talk to you again next week. Go Pack, go!